Greetings everyone, this is Ahab Ever from the Chronicles of Ahab Ever, and today I'm going to be doing a video about who is a Jew according to Torath Mosheh. Now, the basic question that someone could ask is, which does get asked sometimes, is what is a Jew, who is a Jew? And first and foremost, and I've covered this in other videos, the word Jew is more of a westernized term used to describe the Hebrew term Yehudi. And Yehudi basically at one point meant that someone who was living in the region of Yehuda, in the land of Israel here, or someone who descends directly from Yehuda ben Yaakov. Essentially, those are the two methodologies used today, especially since the exile took place of the Babylonian exile and also the Roman exile of Jews from this region. So then this brings the question that some people ask, and I will relate it in this following way to understand what exactly it means to the Jewish community, or what does it mean to the Yehudim, like what exactly is a Jew. So let's take this people here. If we look at anyone on this slide, how do we identify if any of the people here are Jewish or not? I mean, is it that, a certain facial structure makes them Jewish? Is it that a certain way that they stand, or a way that they lean, the way that they hold something? Does that identify them as being Jewish? And according to Torath Mosheh, none of those things are factors in determining who is a Jew. So when dealing with Jewish identification, meaning Torath Mosheh based Jewish identification, only dealing with Torath Mosheh, Jewish identification, and I've explained what Torath Mosheh is in previous videos, so you can go look at those videos to see what that means. This is how it would work, and I'll be going through these slides just kind of bit by bit to explain that. When we start talking about what is the Torath Mosheh talk about, one of the first things that comes up is leadership, meaning leadership, a Torah-based leadership. And if you can go across the Jewish world, what you find is a variance of people who are considered by each ancient Jewish community to be the leaders of those communities and to be the people who have received and transmitted the Torah throughout the generations. And pretty much in every community you can find people who can trace that lineage back to the time when the Torah was given in Har Sinai, and then even further back to Avraham ben Terach, who started the process of there being the Torath Mosheh nation, if you will. Essentially, the next thing you look at is you say, okay, there are common daily and personal and seasonal judicial and philosophical traits that each of these communities have that link them together as being Torath Mosheh, Jewish, if you will, or Yehudim, according to Torath Mosheh, or Yisraelim, according to Torath Mosheh. So that it doesn't matter, if you look at the clothing and things like that, there's certain things that you see as common traits, not just in the way that they dress specifically, but also in the way that they act, the things that they do, and when they do those things. You also find a common acceptance of what text, ancient text and even modern text, are acceptable in these communities. First and foremost being the Torah, and then also any ancient text connected to it. Now, because of, I guess you could say, recent events, a person can say, well, there's a debate that someone could have about what exactly is considered an authentic or authoritative text. Well, amongst the Jewish community, that's already known. So someone who's not a Jew or doesn't identify as being a Jew, for example, may have something else that they consider to be a valid methodology of a text that means something to them. Well, in the Torath Mosheh Jewish community, or Jewish communities, basically there's an acceptance of certain texts that have a certain background and what those texts mean. And those texts, for example, may be found in one book that is, several hundred years old, and the books that exist now are copied from those older texts. And that's one of the things that there's what's called a process of transmission, a masoreth, that essentially means that if you have a text today that is like 700 years old, 1,000 years old, in the Jewish community, that means it was copied from a text that was also several hundred years old prior to it, and also maybe 1,000 years older to it. So even if you go to a bookstore and buy, like, for example, a Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, the Torah, in a book form, many of these books will put in the front of the book exactly what they got copied from and how far back the copies go, and some cases where those copies came from also. And along with that, you have a situation where there are certain legal as well as philosophical works that are accepted across the board in Jewish communities, in Torath Mosheh Jewish communities. It doesn't mean that everybody holds by every single idea that is in a philosophical text, for example. It just simply means that they're aware of it, they know of it, and they learn from it, and they may form their own decisions based upon either agreeing or disagreeing with it. But at the end of the day, when it comes to the Torath Mosheh Jewish community, there are things that are considered to be, for example, halakha, meaning that they came from a bet din hagadol, or Sanhedrin, or even you could say a Mosaic court, which are across the board for all Torath Mosheh Jews, required, something that we hold by. And then there are areas where we're not required to have any particular opinion or a particular practice on a certain thing. And in those areas, we have the freedom to like make our own decisions, or even communities have the freedom to make those decisions. But anything that's halakha, that's law for everybody. Anything that has room to do, the way you want to do it is open. And in an area where you're allowed to have your own philosophical output, that's so for example, I've mentioned on this channel before that I hold by the Rambam, in many areas, but he's not the only source of information I go by, whether it be the Mishnah Torah, the Moreh Nevuchim, whether it be the Rambam's commentary on the Mishnah, whether it be the Sefer HaMitzvot, or even the Egrot of the Rambam. Those to me are like starting points that I use, but not the only ones. So I have no problem using other texts from other communities as well as other sources and other time periods, as long as they meet the requirement of being Torath Mosheh. I'm willing to, investigate them, look at them, and form an opinion. So the next thing is to say, okay, well, what makes someone Jewish in terms of like the settings? What are common community settings that identifiable Torath Mosheh Jewish community? So the first one, of course, is one of the most central areas is the Bet Knesset, or in English people say the synagogue. It doesn't matter where in the world you go. If it's Torath Mosheh, you're going to find something that's common with it, especially when you're dealing with prior to 300 years ago, prior to the modern day European Jewish movements. Within ancient Jewish communities, there's some commonality in terms of these structures and, like, for the most part, what you look like. So it means that about 1,000 years ago, or 100 years ago, if you're looking at Jews in Yemen, you would see something that is common, especially if you look at this picture. This is Jews from Yemen before they came to Israel. And you see common things like on the left, you see Torah scrolls that are inside of a space in the wall called the Aron. And you see Jews sitting and learning from like Torah and Halakha in a common way that you see in other areas. For example, Jews in North Africa. You see a common thing where behind them, for example, in this picture, you see them having an Aron where there are Torah scrolls. You see them learning, and also like doing Tehillim and things like that, in the same way you would find in any Jewish community around the world that holds by Torah. And along with that, you have a common method of teaching and continued learning from cradle to grave that is common amongst ancient and even modern Torath Mosheh communities. In the same way that the Torah is being taught in ancient times, the same way that Torath Mosheh Jews are teaching it now. And also the concept of having a mikvah, a place where where basically the situation where what's called nida is addressed. Even if, for example, this mikvah is a modern one that is like very fancy, very nice, but even in ancient times, the same standards for like the measurements, the amount of water, the basic requirements existed several thousand years ago and exist today. So if you were to go to a place where there are Jews who are Torath Mosheh and you find them, you would know that there's a mikvah somewhere in that area. If you go to a city, for example, and you see that there are like, let's say, Jews there, but there's no mikveh anywhere, you can kind of assume that there's no Torath Mosheh potentially there. Because pretty much every Torath Mosheh Jew I know would have a mikveh somewhere, whether they have to build it privately or whether they have to build it as a community site. So then in terms of Jewish family tree, so in terms of the Jewish family tree, one of the things that I've mentioned in this video is exactly how you get to these different types of Jewish communities in different regions, and the commonality that existed between them, even coming from the Torah of Mount Sinai, and then going to the time when there was an Israeli kingdom, and then after the exile, both of them, you had Jews from Yemen, you had Jews from Mizrach, you had Jews who were part of the second exile, who also followed Torath Mosheh, who were Sephardic, and then you have those who were Ashkenazi. So essentially, you also had people who are nowadays reconnected with being Jewish, who have unclear origins, or come from peoples who have legends about them being Jewish. So essentially what you have is a situation where when you're identifying who's exactly Jewish in the modern time, a person can say, okay, well, if I look at a person, how can I tell? Well, as an example, I can look at this picture and tell that these are Jews from Haban, from Yemen. There's certain things and certain traits. For example, Jews in Yemen, the men would often wear what's called a sadin around their head, and they would put like different plants on top of it. And they would also wear like a sash that goes to the side, and women who were like Yemenite Jewish would also dress a certain way. But there are certain traits beyond that if they would pull out a Torah scroll, if they were to pray a certain types of prayer, if they were speaking Hebrew, if they were writing in Hebrew, if they were wearing tefillin, if they were wearing tzitzit, and obviously, that's clear. So what that means is that no matter where Jews in the world went, there are certain things that are identifiable, meaning that if your parents were Jewish and they raised you as a Jew, then pretty much you know that you're a Jew. And that's the essential point, that around the world you have different groups of people who were raised by Jewish parents, who did Jewish things, and they go back and their grandparents were also raising them as being Jewish. Their grandparents did Jewish things. So essentially that's one of the ways to identify. And the second way is when you have people who join the Jewish community through a process called Giyur. And essentially those are two methodologies for being Jewish. So essentially what you have is a situation where being Jewish by Torath Mosheh standards is pretty simple. Either a person is raised within a Jewish community from Jewish parents, who keep Torath Mosheh, meaning that they do the Torah and the mitzvot that were, came from Mount Sinai, and also the rulings coming from the Sanhedrin, or there's someone who has joined a Jewish community, a Torath Mosheh Jewish community, and has, basically aligned themselves with the Jewish community and married within the Jewish community who keeps Torath Mosheh. So essentially, that's how Torath Mosheh defines being Jewish. And if you look at my other videos, it kind of explains in more detail exactly what Torath Mosheh is beyond just the Jewish identification. So again, this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and I hope that helps out. Take care. Bye.